The moment I realized something was wrong with our finances was embarrassingly ordinary. I was standing in a grocery store on a quiet Tuesday morning, holding a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, when my debit card was declined. At first I thought it was just one of those random banking errors that happen sometimes. The cashier tried the card again, but the result was the same. Declined. I remember feeling my face grow hot while the line behind me grew impatient. I paid with the last $20 in my wallet and walked out of the store feeling confused and strangely uneasy. The uneasy feeling didn't go away when I got to the car. Instead, it got worse. I opened our banking app and stared at the number on the screen, convinced I must be reading it wrong. Our checking account balance was $14. Just 3 days earlier we had more than $8,000 in that account. My first thought was fraud. My second thought was panic. I called my husband Mark immediately. He answered quickly, but he sounded distracted. I told him what had happened and asked if he had noticed anything unusual with the account. There was a short pause before he answered, which I didn't think much about at the time. He told me he hadn't checked yet but would look at it when he got home from work. His calmness should have reassured me, but instead it made me feel more anxious. Something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. That evening Mark came home later than usual. We sat at the kitchen table while I showed him the account balance on my phone. Instead of reacting with shock the way I expected, he looked uncomfortable. He scrolled through the transaction history and then quietly said that the money had been transferred. When I asked where it had gone, he hesitated before telling me something that completely confused me. The money had been transferred to his mother. At first I thought I misunderstood him. My mother-in-law Diane had always been involved in our lives in small ways, but nothing like that. I asked Mark why his mother would have any connection to our bank account. He explained it in a way that sounded casual, almost dismissive. According to him, Diane sometimes helped manage finances and moved money into savings when necessary. He described it as something practical and responsible, as if it were perfectly normal. But the more he explained, the less normal it sounded. I asked him directly if Diane had access to our bank account. After a long pause, he admitted that she did. Not just basic access either. She could see transactions and move money when she thought it was necessary. When I asked how long this had been happening, he said it had started before we got married. Apparently, Diane had helped him organize his finances years earlier when he was dealing with debt, and he had trusted her advice ever since. That was the first moment I felt a quiet sense of shock settle in my chest. Mark and I had been married for 5 years. In all that time, I believed we managed our finances together like any normal couple. I had never imagined that a third person, especially a parent, was involved behind the scenes. As the evening went on, memories started surfacing in my mind that suddenly looked different. There had been times when Mark seemed unusually nervous about spending money. Occasionally a planned purchase would mysteriously become too expensive overnight, even when our savings seemed healthy. At the time I assumed he was simply being cautious. Now I began to wonder if those decisions were actually coming from someone else. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight I opened the banking app again and started looking more closely at the transaction history. What I found made my stomach tighten. The large transfer to Diane's account wasn't the only one. There were dozens of smaller transactions spread throughout the past year. Some were labeled as adjustments or transfers. Others had no explanation at all. Individually they were small enough to go unnoticed. But together they added up to thousands of dollars moving between our account and hers. The next morning I decided to look at the account permissions, something I had never done before. I assumed it would list Mark and me as the only authorized users. Instead I saw 3 names. Mine, Mark's, and Diane's. What really caught my attention was the line underneath her name. According to the bank records, Diane wasn't just an authorized viewer. She had full transfer permissions. Even more surprising, she was listed as the primary financial administrator on the account. I stared at the screen in disbelief. That description implied a level of control that went far beyond casual advice. It meant the bank essentially recognized her as the person overseeing the account structure. In other words, the system treated her as the one in charge. While I was still processing that discovery, my phone buzzed with a text message. The message was from Diane. She wrote that Mark had mentioned my concerns about the transfers and that she would stop by in the evening to explain everything. The message sounded calm and friendly, as if this were a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a short conversation. But something deep in my instincts told me the situation wasn't simple at all. When Diane arrived that evening, she carried a lemon cake and greeted me the same way she always did. Her tone was warm and relaxed, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. We sat in the kitchen, and she explained that she had moved the money because she believed we were about to make a bad financial decision. Apparently Mark had mentioned we were considering a kitchen renovation. Diane believed the renovation was unnecessary and decided it would be safer to move the money until we reconsidered. Listening to her explanation felt surreal. She spoke calmly, as if it were completely reasonable for her to step in and control our financial choices. Mark sat quietly during most of the conversation, occasionally nodding when she mentioned past situations where she had helped him avoid debt. That was when another piece of the story surfaced. Years before I met him, Mark had been struggling with nearly $60,000 of student loan debt and credit card balances. Diane had helped him organize a repayment plan and had even covered part of the debt herself. According to Mark, that experience was the reason he trusted her judgment so much. While I could understand gratitude, I still couldn't understand why that meant she should control our finances years later. I asked Diane directly how often she moved money without telling us. She answered calmly that she only intervened when she believed it was necessary to protect our long-term stability. The conversation ended with a promise. Diane said she would explain everything in detail, including the structure of the account and the financial decisions she had made over the years. She suggested we all sit down the following night and review the records together. After she left, I opened the bank history again and began calculating the transfers. By the time I finished adding them up, my hands were shaking. Because the total amount of money Diane had moved in and out of our account over the past several years wasn't a few $1,000s. It was closer to $30,000. And at that moment I realized something that frightened me far more than the missing money. If my mother-in-law had been quietly controlling our finances for years, then I had no idea how many of the decisions in our marriage had actually been ours. The next evening we sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the bank statement spread across the screen. Diane approached the conversation with a calm confidence that almost made it feel like a business meeting rather than a family discussion. She explained that when Mark was younger he had struggled badly with financial discipline. According to her, the debt he accumulated in his 20s had nearly destroyed his credit. Helping him recover from that situation had taken years of careful planning. When Mark met me, Diane said she was relieved to see him building a stable life. However, she also worried that he might fall back into old habits. Because of that concern, she and Mark had created a system before our wedding that allowed her to oversee his financial activity. At the time, Mark had believed this arrangement would only last until he felt fully confident managing money on his own. But years passed, and the arrangement quietly continued. Hearing that explanation felt surreal. I had always believed Mark and I were learning and making financial decisions together as a couple. Now it seemed that many of those decisions had actually been influenced by someone else behind the scenes. I asked Diane why no one had ever told me about this system. She answered that she believed the arrangement would only cause unnecessary stress in the marriage. Then I asked a question that had been bothering me since the night before. I pointed to a series of monthly transfers totaling nearly $30,000 over 4 years and asked what those payments were for. Diane explained that when Mark had first addressed his debt problems, she personally covered a large portion of the remaining balance. The monthly transfers I was seeing were reimbursements to her. In other words, Mark had been paying his mother back using money from our shared account. The part that shocked me most wasn't the repayment itself. It was the fact that I had never known it was happening. For several minutes the room felt painfully quiet. I looked at Mark, waiting for some explanation that would make sense of everything. He admitted that he had avoided telling me about the repayment plan because he felt embarrassed about how serious his financial problems had been in the past. He convinced himself that keeping it private was easier than reopening an old mistake. That admission hurt more than I expected. Marriage is built on trust, and realizing that such a major financial obligation had been hidden from me for years made me question how transparent our partnership really was. At the same time, I could see that Mark wasn't acting out of malice. He had simply allowed an old dependency to continue because it felt familiar and safe. The deeper issue was Diane's role in that dependency. Throughout the conversation, she continued to speak about our finances as if she were responsible for protecting them. She explained that several of our canceled plans, like a vacation we once discussed taking and a furniture purchase we postponed, had been influenced by her advice to Mark. From her perspective, she was preventing us from making unnecessary expenses that could threaten long-term stability. From my perspective, she had been quietly shaping our life without my knowledge. The realization was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Mark began to see the situation differently as we talked. At first he defended his mother's intentions, emphasizing how much she had helped him in the past. But as we reviewed the records together, he also recognized that the arrangement had continued far longer than it should have. At one point he admitted something that seemed surprisingly honest. He said that relying on his mother's oversight had made financial decisions feel less stressful. Instead of learning to manage everything himself, he had simply allowed her to remain in control. That moment shifted the conversation. For the first time, Mark acknowledged that the system wasn't healthy anymore. He said he wanted us to manage our finances independently as a couple, even if that meant making mistakes along the way. Diane reacted with visible frustration, arguing that removing her from the account could expose us to unnecessary risk. However, Mark remained firm. Over the following weeks we began the complicated process of restructuring our finances. Because Diane had originally helped establish the account during Mark's credit recovery, removing her access required opening new accounts and transferring everything over. It wasn't a quick or easy process. There were meetings with the bank, paperwork, and several tense phone calls between Mark and his mother. Eventually the new accounts were created and Diane's access was removed. For the first time since our marriage began, Mark and I were the only people with control over our finances. The change felt strangely unfamiliar at first. Mark admitted he was nervous about managing everything without his mother's oversight. I felt nervous too, but for a different reason. After everything that had happened, I realized how easily trust can be shaped by hidden arrangements. Despite the tension, something positive slowly began to emerge. Instead of relying on outside guidance, Mark and I started having honest conversations about our financial goals. We talked openly about spending, saving, and long-term plans in a way we never had before. Those conversations weren't always comfortable, but they were real. Our relationship with Diane also changed. She still calls occasionally, and we see her during family gatherings, but the dynamic is different now. The quiet authority she once had over our finances no longer exists. The boundaries are clearer, even if they sometimes feel awkward. Looking back on everything, I don't believe Diane intended to harm our marriage. In her mind she was protecting her son from mistakes she had seen him make before. But good intentions can still lead to unhealthy control when they go unquestioned for too long. The experience forced Mark and me to confront something important about our relationship. Marriage isn't just about sharing a home or a bank account. It's about sharing responsibility and trust, even when that trust means allowing each other to make imperfect decisions. Today our finances are far from perfect. We still argue about spending sometimes, and we occasionally second-guess our choices. But at least those decisions finally belong to us. And after everything that happened, having that simple freedom feels more valuable than any amount of money that ever sat in our bank account.